Hey, my name is Sean, and today I'm going to be going over the gear that I'm taking to get some great pictures at a volleyball tournament that I'm heading to in just a couple hours. So let's go over the lenses that I'm going to be using today. So the first one is my most recent favorite that I've been using, especially in poor lighting environments, these convention centers and a lot of the local gyms that have poor lighting for volleyball. And this is a Sigma 85mm prime lens. That's f1.4. All right, the second lens that I'm going to be using today is the Sony 24-105 f4 lens. Now, there's a pretty significant difference between the two as far as aperture. The first one was 1.4. This one is an f4. All right, so let's head out to the venue, and we'll take a look at the results afterwards. All right, now we're back from the tournament, so let's see how these images stack up next to each other. So I've already gone through, I've culled through the images, I've edited them, I've shared them with the teams. They have already been posted. They're out on social media. And if you want to know my process for that, I'm going to do an in-depth video on each of those processes so that you can learn to get quicker with that, so you can get those images out fast. But for this video, let's focus on the comparison of the two lenses. So on the left is going to be the Sony lens, and on the right is going to be the Sigma lens. And I'm going to try and show similar images and from similar positions of both of these. And they were taken from the same position, the same court, and the same venue, right? Again, on the left is the Sony lens, on the right is the Sigma lens. So let's start with the left with the Sony lens. So if I just zoom in just on the Sony lens, you'll be able to see that it tells a different story, right? So overall, you've got more involved in this story. You're able to see not only the server, but you can see the line judge kind of looking towards. Even though they're slightly out of focus, you can still see what's going on. You can see the team, and at the front, you can see the coach looking towards the other side of the court. Right, so you can see a little bit more going on in the overall story with this. Now, I will say this is already edited, and if I bring up the information in this photo, you're going to see that this was shot at 52mm, so I was able to zoom out, which allowed me to get this landscape photo. It was at 1/800th of a second, so I actually bring down the shutter speed from where I like it at 1/1000th because the ISO was so high. So even with this in a pretty well-lit environment, with f4.0, in order to get that shutter speed at 1/800 or 1/800th of a second, I had to have the ISO, or auto ISO had this at 12,800. So it was fairly high. Now, if I take a look at this image, this is edited, and this was with a denoise already. So this went through the denoise feature here in Lightroom. So I actually pull up the original photo. So this is the original photo, and you can see it actually was a little bit even wider. So I cropped that a little bit to get rid of kind of the bathroom in the back. But what you can see is on the original photo, there is still a fair amount of grain or noise in this photo. And so before I wanted to get that out, I did have to edit it, and then went through the Lightroom denoise function. And that brought it to, this is kind of more that final image where it's a little bit cleaner. So I was able to share that and kind of get that noise out. But that's a little bit more I had to do on the backside with the editing. Now, if we come back out, let's take a look at the one on the right side from the Sigma lens. You can see this was at the 85mm because prime lens, that's not going to change. I was able to have the shutter speed at 1/1000th of a second. You can actually see that there's a little bit less motion blur on the ball in this photo than the last one. Aperture at 1.4. And so the ISO is way down. So this is at 2000. So I did not have to put this through any kind of denoise program. So if I zoom in, you're already going to be able to see that there's way less grain or noise on this one. Again, this is not going through the denoise program. So I did do some editing. So there is some edits. And I also did crop this a little bit. So you can see the original image had a little bit more of the floor in the image. Now, this image tells a completely different story. Like I said, this is focused more on the player. And I was not able to do a landscape shot with this because the 85 millimeters, I had to switch this to portrait in order to get the full player and the ball in there. All right, next up, let's take a look at some hitting pictures. So again, if I'm sharing these with family, oftentimes they're going to want to see the hitter's face. I might take it from their side. But when I'm sharing this with players, players love to have this type of photo where it's from behind and they're getting their hit. So I get these pictures all the time. So once again, on the left is the Sony lens, and on the right is the Sigma lens. So let's take a look a little bit in detail of these. So I'm going to zoom in to the one on the left, so the Sony lens. So with this, you can see overall a good photo for this hitter. So a left-sided, she's a a left-handed right side hitter. If I go to the information, this was 1/1000th of a second, f 4.0. And the way I was focused, there was more light in there. And actually, the ISO was down at a good amount. This is at 6400, right? So in this situation, the ISO wasn't too high. I actually think that it did really well. However, again, this is an edited photo. So let me see if I can get into the original. And the original, I was at a wider angle, right? I was zoomed out a little bit because I can with that camera, but then I had to crop in to get what I wanted for the hit. Now, this can be a benefit sometimes because you're able to have a little bit more of the action in your cameras than you're not missing and cutting something. But obviously, there's going to be some degradation when you start to cut or zoom in like this. So this was the original shot. Not only can you see that it is cropped in, but you can see that overall it was a lot darker. And there was a fair amount of grain in the photo in the original shot. Now, after editing, putting again through the Lightroom denoise feature, kind of lightening things up a little bit, you can see the end shot is still very usable. You can see the players on the other side are in focus pretty well. This player number 6 on the right, you can pretty much still see them, and number 13 here on the left. So this shows a little bit more what's happening overall because it's f4. You get a little bit more of focal range. Now, if I take a look at the other photo, it'll be a little bit different. So if we get back to the comparison shot, we'll look at the one on the right, and I'll dive in a little bit deeper. The one on the right here is with the Sigma lens. So again, if we look at the information, this is always the 85 millimeter with this lens. This is at 1/1000th of a second, f1.4. The ISO is 1000. So again, the ISO on the other one is 6400. ISO with this one is 1000. And this I did not have to run through denoise. All right, so I did do some editing. I brought the exposure up just a little bit. The temperature was changed, but I did not have to do any denoise. There was no real grain in the photo. So did not have to do as much editing. Now, again, you can see the difference in the focus on the players. So the blocker is already starting to be out of focus. The defender is definitely out of focus. So this is a shot where you're really focused on the single player. And again, I had to tilt my camera so that this is done in a portrait mode because the hitter was on the same side I was. I was backed up just a little bit, kind of on the coach's bench, and I had to make sure that I had this in portrait mode, whereas the other one I could keep in landscape and kind of crop out of that. All right, now let's move on to a blocking shot. Now, these are not exact, but they are very, very close. So this is the same court. It's just two different teams playing. And what you're going to see is, again, the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right. And again, they're telling very different stories. So I want to start with the Sony on the left. So if we move into that photo, you'll be able to see that I can see a little bit more of the action. So I'm able to see the hitter. You can see the block. You can see the other players, how they're reacting. And I'm able to be zoomed out a little bit to get this in a landscape format so that I have the whole picture. What you can see in this is the benefit of the f4 is both the blockers are in focus and so is the hitter on the other side. When I brought this up, it was fairly grainy. So I did run this through a denoise program so that it had a little bit less grain, so that I was able to get that back to the team and to the parents. Now let's take a look at the Sigma. Okay, so now if we look at the photo from the Sigma, again, from a similar spot on the court, but you're able to see this is it's tighter focus just on these players. So this, I actually brought the shutter speed up a little bit because the ISO was still fairly low in this. Again, same court, but with this f1.4, the ISO was 1600, and this is with one over 1250. So I was able to bump the shutter speed up. These players are at the 17s level, whereas the other players are at the 14s. So the action was a little bit faster. You can see that these blockers are in focus, but that player looking up is not in focus. They're completely out of focus. So you can see, again, it's a much sharper image on these two players, but doesn't tell that whole story. I'm not able to see the hitter. I'm not able to see the other players in this because I was at the 85 millimeters. I didn't have the option to zoom out. And again, I had to switch this to portrait in order to get the blockers that I wanted. So a difference, but I didn't have to do as much editing with this. So I still did some. Actually, doesn't look like there was much. So if I just hit auto and we zoom in a little bit, so there's really not much I needed to do. So it looks like I had the focus set for this player here. And so the player on the outside is slightly out of focus, but really can't tell much when you're out at the main photo. So overall, again, just a little bit different story. All right, the last one I'll look at is kind of the candid shots, or shots where there's multiple players that would be nice to have in focus. And so I didn't have exact comparisons in this. So I try to get something that you could at least see the difference with. And so in this case, again, Sony's on the left, Sigma's on the right. So with this Sony, this image, I'll pick this one out specifically. You're able to see more of the people in focus. So not only do we have kind of the backs of these two players, which is the team I was with, but you can see they're pretty much in focus 4.0, which allowed that, to get more people in focus. The focal length was 105, so I had brought that telephoto lens of Sony and zoomed in as much as I could, and still able to get that f4.0 with it. I decreased the shutter speed a little bit because as I was using this lens, I brought it back down. With this type of photo, I could have decreased it even more. There's not a lot of fast-paced action, but that's what it was set for, and the ISO is 8,000. All right, let's look at the other photo. And so you can see, even though their players are not as close to each other, there's a pretty significant difference of who's in focus and who's out of focus. So this is 85 millimeter, 1/1000th of a second, f1.4, and the ISO is at 1,000. These two players are in focus. Players behind are not. And even though they are a little bit further away than that last group, there's still, you can see the difference in this. So if you wanted to have kind of those group photos where there's a little bit more going on, sometimes it is nice to have that aperture a little bit, towards that f4 so you can get more of that action. Now, for me, there was a clear winner. I like the f1.4 lens. It just allowed me to do so much more. Now, the hard part about it is there's no zoom to that. So I really had to make sure I was positioned correctly to get the photos I wanted. And so to get all the different players, I had to make sure I was moving around the court and getting them when they were on the court themselves. So that was a little bit more difficult, but the pictures came out better. And the truth is that even with that f1.4 lens, you can adjust the aperture to get it at f4.0 as well. Right? You don't have to stay at 1.4. I just did that in this videos to show you the difference in those two. Now, one thing to always keep in mind when you're looking at lenses is the cost of the lens. And so these two are similar in cost, although the Sony is more expensive. So the Sony right now on Amazon or B&H is around $1,300, where the Sigma lens is around $950. There are some great sites that sell used lenses online. I actually picked this one up off Facebook Marketplace for significantly less than the list price. Now, of course, there's always going to be other lenses out there, and I'm going to list two right now that you should also keep in mind as you're looking at it. One is the Tamron lens, and so Tamron has a great lens out. It's 35 millimeters to 150 millimeters. It's f2 to 2.8, and I've used that multiple times, especially in low-lit gyms and when I'm at high school games, because it allows me a little bit more focal zoom, but it's a very heavy lens, and it's hard to have all day at a tournament. Also, Sony just released a great lens. It's f2.0, and it's 50 to 150 millimeters. So again, it's great aperture, wonderful zoom range, but it's almost $4,000. So again, a significant difference from what I'm looking at when I'm at the tournament. All right, I hope that was helpful. Be sure to check out the other videos in the series as we dive into different ways to make your volleyball pictures that much better. All right, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.